Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, May 5th, 2020. Cinco de Mayo. Happy Cinco de Mayo. Maybe you're going to have a Corona all by yourself. It might help their sales. It's a brand that's been damaged by recent events. I ask you to indulge me with the lead package here in today's podcast. These are unrelated issues that I see as part of a larger pattern. And I have to say that I'm inconclusive about some of the things I'm going to report and comment on. But I want to provoke you to think about it. And you, as always, are entitled to decide for yourself. That's my whole purpose here at the Peter B. Collins podcast. I consider you thinking adults, and I would be shocked if you always agree with my commentary and analysis. So first up, I want to talk about the political demonization of China by members of the Trump administration, including the Orange Blob himself. And I was provoked myself by an article at The Guardian today. And I'm often a little bit skeptical of The Guardian. They typically cozy up to U.S. foreign policy. But in an article that came from Washington under the byline of Julian Borger, the headline reads, U.S. uses coronavirus to challenge Chinese Communist Party's grip on power. Now, we've heard Trump call it the Wuhan virus. We have seen public opinion shift. We'll cite some numbers here in a minute or two. And China is kind of being treated the way Russia was used in the 2016 campaign. This offshore, murky force that we need to be afraid of. And I'm not an apologist for the Chinese government, its tactics, its repression, its censorship, its authoritarian control of its people. But I am still infused with Pepe Escobar's commentary from our recent podcast. Hope you've listened to it. If not, I recommend it. About the hybrid warfare that started with Trump's misguided trade war, and he hasn't backed off on any of those tariffs despite the pandemic, despite our reliance on China for medical supplies, and whenever we get back up and running for the supply chain for virtually everything that we consume in this country, particularly our electronic toys. And so you know that Mike Pompeo has been the point man. He keeps just asserting that China is responsible for the coronavirus and the pandemic that it has led to. And he represents a faction of the administration that even wants to demand money damages from the Chinese government. And my big question is this for domestic consumption to create a boogeyman that Trump can run against? Or is this part of a larger effort, and maybe they're not disconnected, to destabilize certain areas of the world and using the coronavirus as kind of a fog? And so this I did not see reported in American outlets. That's why I'm relying on The Guardian for this. But Monday, the Deputy National Security Advisor, who you and I have never heard of, Matthew Pottinger, delivered a speech in fluent Mandarin, reports The Guardian. And he warned Beijing that its efforts to suppress internal criticism were doomed to backfire. And listen to this coded language. When small acts of bravery are stamped out by governments, big acts of bravery follow. Now, the remarks were delivered by video to a University of Virginia webinar because he can't go to the Council of Foreign Relations or the Heritage Foundation or some other friendly think tank to unload these little bomblets these days. Podger asked whether China today would benefit from a little less nationalism and a little more populism. Quote, democratic populism is less about left versus right than top versus bottom. It's about reminding a few that they need the consent of many to govern. When a privileged few grow too remote and self-interested, populism is what pulls them back or pitches them overboard. Now, let's just put aside the rank hypocrisy of the Trump administration talking about the consent of many to govern and criticizing a privileged few who grow too remote and self-interested. All right, we're just going to put that aside. So The Guardian goes to Bonnie Glaser, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. To me, she says, it's the most remarkable speech we've ever seen from anyone in the Trump administration. If you're a member of the Chinese Communist Party, she says, you might read the invocation of the May 4th movement as encouraging people to challenge some of the existing parts of your political system. It didn't quite say overthrow your leaders, but it certainly encouraged the rise of the masses, shall we say. Now back to the voice of the Guardian reporter. Trump's own affinity and admiration for Xi Jinping has been a counterweight to China hawks in his administration, like Pottinger, a former Beijing-based journalist who reportedly led the push to insist on the term Wuhan virus. Continuing to quote the article, Pompeo has so far led the charge against China, issuing an inflammatory tweet on Sunday declaring China has a history of infecting the world and they have a history of running substandard laboratories. Pompeo claimed there was enormous evidence that this virus originated in a Wuhan laboratory. The evidence hasn't been presented, and most experts say the disease most likely evolved from interaction between animals and humans. As you know, I consider that an open question. We don't know where it came from. It could have come from a biolab in China, in the United States, or elsewhere. And we have the AIDS Nobel Prize-winning researcher from France, Luc Montagnier, who says that it was fiddled with in a lab because it includes some HIV strings. One more quote here from The Guardian. The Trump administration's campaign against China in the coming months will be both economic and diplomatic. The president has said he's contemplating punitive measures, exploring whether the U.S. might sue China or cancel some of its debt to China as reparations. As you know, I'm highly skeptical of that. I think that is all talk for domestic consumption. But they are so unhinged, we can't rely on rational behavior. Now to a May 4th report that was updated today, published in the New York Times by 3 female reporters with Chinese surnames. And I don't know any of these reporters, Vivian Wang, Amy Quinn, and Sui Li Wei. But I do note that there is no dateline to the story. The New York Times is quite rigorous. The first word in a published article shows you where it came from: Washington, New York, Tel Aviv. This one has no dateline. And I find it reporting fact, but in a context that promotes xenophobia, the fear of China. Here's the opening 2 paragraphs. The text messages to the Chinese activists streamed in from ordinary Wuhan residents, making the same extraordinary request: help me sue the Chinese government. One said his mother had died from the coronavirus after being turned away from multiple hospitals. Another said her father-in-law had died in quarantine. But after weeks of back-and-forth planning, the 7 residents who'd reached out to Yang Zhangqing, the activist, who, by the way, is in New York, suddenly changed their minds in late April or stopped responding. At least 2 of them had been threatened by the police, Mr. Yang said. So the report is that Chinese authorities are clamping down, and that is pretty ordinary behavior in China. They don't like people to report things that are contrary to the official line. They have, I think, the world's biggest censorship operation. And it doesn't stop with just blocking publication. They punish or detain people who engage in it. The article continues, lawyers have been warned not to file suit against the government. The police have interrogated bereaved family members who connected with others like them online. Volunteers who tried to thwart the state's censorship apparatus by preserving reports about the outbreak have disappeared. And we skip a paragraph. The crackdown underscores the party's fear that any attempt to dwell on what happened in Wuhan or to hold officials responsible will undermine the state's narrative that only China's authoritarian system saved the country from a devastating health crisis. Now, as it reveals propaganda, my view is that this article promotes American propaganda. And it is the tone of it and the timing that make me question the motivation behind this article. And then there's this. I want to thank listener and subscriber Andrea Hegland, who sent me a document here, and I am linking to it for you to study. It runs 87 pages. It is written in a very formal scientific report format. And they reveal quite a bit, or so it seems. Let me quote, "The goal of this document is to examine evidence that may prove that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was present at a biolaboratory in Wuhan, China, and 2, that virus was introduced into the greater Wuhan population by an infected lab worker or animal." Now, in bold print, this document does not attempt to provide a concrete conclusion on whether either claim is factually true. Rather, it examines the probability that each claim is true to allow the reader to make his or her own conclusions. What is the source of this? Well, it's at a web page called project.evidence.github. And they disclose, or do not disclose, we are an anonymous group of researchers. We are not affiliated with any company, nation, state, or organization. We are not receiving funding from any sources, public or private. We disavow all racism and violent attacks, including those aimed at the Asian or Chinese people, and we will continue to disavow them throughout this paper. We are not doing this because we hate China, but because we love the truth. Next, they note that this was first published on April 16th and updated on May the 2nd. They write, if the scientific community can provide peer-reviewed studies that prove that the spillover event occurred in the wild, that is, outside of a lab and with no connection to lab researchers, we will add an addendum to this document highlighting those results. Studies proving the virus was not engineered do not prove the spillover event occurred outside of a laboratory. We are not claiming the virus was engineered. All right. So then, this is paragraph 6.1. We believe in holding the Chinese government accountable for changes in regulations and policies that can prevent another laboratory accident. In particular, we'd like to see a nationally unified movement toward transparency so the world may rest assured in the belief that China will not hide the next pandemic, natural or otherwise, if it occurs under their jurisdiction. So their focus, they say, is on lab safety. So what it does is publish a series of abstracts of different documents that are presented as scientific research. Then at item 12, there's a conclusion. At some point in late 2019, many people who visited the Huanan seafood market fell ill due to a new disease. To date, the origin of this disease is unknown. The market is less than 9 miles from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and that's part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Then they have a series of bullet points about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that it collaborated with French authorities to construct this level of a lab meant to inspect its safety standards, and that the French bailed out of the project. French scientists who were supposed to work there were never sent there. Now that suggests to me that insiders at the Wuhan Institute of Virology are at least participating in this document. They developed chimeric SARS-like coronaviruses. They conducted dangerous gain-of-function research on the current coronavirus. They established a 96% match with SARS-CoV-2 in a virus they sampled from a cave over 1,000 miles away from Wuhan. They injected live piglets with bat coronaviruses as recently as July last summer. They tested its disinfecting procedures with a bat coronavirus. They published a paper on a close descendant of SARS-CoV-1, the MERS, that's the Mediterranean version, CoV, in November of 19. They collected bat samples with improper PPE even after a researcher was bitten by one. The U.S. State Department claimed inadequate safety at the site, and they deleted a press release detailing the U.S. State Department visit. It has not provided concrete evidence that one of their prior researchers is still alive, despite rumors on Chinese social media that that person is patient zero. They had a researcher accuse the director of the institute of selling infected lab animals to vendors on Weibo. I think that's the Chinese version of Facebook or Twitter. So there is quite a bit here. And, again, I cannot confirm to you who these people are, but as you heard, the level of detail, insider knowledge of the Wuhan Virology Institute is pretty, well, it's there. So I commend you to read this. Again, I am open to trying to present information that could inform us. I'm trying to separate it from the politics of the Trump administration in blaming China, but I do not exonerate China. And I hope you can understand that I'm not trying to be an equivocating, Jello-like figure here, but I am trying to honestly and objectively pursue what comes my way. So for the next item here, I want to note that world leaders, mostly centered in Europe, have pledged $8 billion to develop a vaccine, and they got Madonna to chip in some money. But the United States is standing separate from that effort. And whatever you think of vaccines, there will be an attempt to develop one, and Bill Gates will make sure that it gets rolled out worldwide. And then we turn to Alan McLeod over at Mint Press News. And he's the one who notes that with 69,000 Americans now said to be killed related to the coronavirus, polls show that the American people are extremely worried about contracting it. He says the government has a much bigger concern. If China or anybody else finds a vaccine, that China will copy it and distribute it for free. And he writes to the White House, this would be stealing a potential American innovation. And it would also take the profit motive out of it for the big pharma companies here in the United States. So McLeod cites Dean Baker, who I know. He is at the Center for Economic Policy Research in Washington. He served, I think, as Joe Biden's economics advisor in the Obama White House. And he said he'd be delighted if China stole vaccine technology and gave it to billions of people. Quote, the coronavirus pandemic is a clear instance in which the whole world shares a common interest in developing and distributing a vaccine. This should mean that we have open research where all the findings are posted on the web as quickly as possible so that they can build on them. Once a vaccine is developed, we should want it spread throughout the world as quickly as possible at the lowest possible cost. Trump's concern that China would somehow steal a vaccine means that he's more concerned about protecting someone's profits here, as well as possibly an ego trip, we're number one, than possibly saving hundreds of thousands of lives. And later, McLeod writes that the U.S. government is accusing other nations of hypothetical theft during the pandemic is particularly noteworthy, seeing as it leads the world in the confiscation and detention of medical supplies. And he cites that Barbados had purchased 20 ventilators and the United States kept them for itself, that U.S. officials hijacked a plane full of 60 million masks bound for France while on the runway of a Chinese airport. I have separately cited the heist in Bangkok of a plane load of PPE that had been paid for by Germany and was bound for there when it was somehow diverted to the United States. So I don't have a coherent connection between all of those stories. But if there is one, it is that I see a political effort to paint China as an outlier, as a rogue state, and it could go beyond efforts to just win an election here in the United States in November. Then we turn to Israel. And before I dive into this story, I want to note that yesterday we reported Alison Weir's article at Mint Press News, which cited FBI documents released released as a result of the Roger Stone trial, that showed that Roger Stone was in regular contact with Israeli officials and suggesting that there was covert collusion between Israel and Team Trump to win the 2016 U.S. election. We know there was overt meddling by Netanyahu, which I cited in detail yesterday. And so far, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I checked by searching each website, have not chosen to report on that story. So contrast that to Marjorie Cohn's detailed analysis published at Truth Out and at Consortium News. And I've known Professor Cohn for a long time. She's retired from the Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego, and she is a strong opponent of the extreme right government of Israel. So Professor Cohn opens with a citation about the unity government that Netanyahu and Benny Gantz are attempting to set up in Israel. And there's a picture here of chummy Benny Gantz, the general staff chief of the Israeli Defense Forces, with Benjamin Netanyahu celebrating in 2013 with some sort of a toast. And she writes, one of the central pillars of this new regime is the unlawful annexation of the Jordan Valley and illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. The annexation has the full backing of Donald Trump. Using the time when the world has been busy confronting the COVID-19 pandemic to commit more war crimes is immoral and poses new challenges for the rule of law and human rights. She quotes Raji Sourani, director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. The annexation, slated to begin in July, will include about 30% of the occupied West Bank, including the Jordan Valley and Jewish settlements with about 620,000 Israelis. Both the UN and the European Union cautioned Israel that annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank would be illegal. Moreover, the New Deal requires that the U.S. government agree to Israel's illegal annexation, making Trump complicit in the commission of Israel's war crimes. And she notes that this would violate Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and she says that Israel, since the 1967 war, has maintained an illegal military occupation of the West Bank. And she writes, it is well established that territory cannot be lawfully acquired by war. And moreover, Israel's establishment of settlements in the Palestinian territory constitutes a war crime. And then she continues, Trump is aiding and abetting Israel's war crimes of annexation. In January, his administration unveiled its deal of the century, supposedly aimed at achieving peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and that was ginned up by the Crown Prince, Jared Kushner, and his buddies. And she notes that the Trump deal is fully supported by both Benny Gantz, the purported former opposition to Netanyahu. So I think that's an important thing that is off the radar. We're not seeing coverage of that in the mainstream media as the fog of coronavirus infects most coverage here in the United States. And then there is the comical mercenary-led effort, and these are mercenaries based in the United States, to invade Venezuela that was busted up this past weekend. And the Washington Post has been covering this because they got the exclusive interview with the American guy who is running the operation, and I'll get to his name in a moment. But the New York Times has had very light coverage. They did publish a story today, but yesterday they were content just to publish President Trump's denial of U.S. government involvement in this latest effort to take down the Maduro government in Caracas. And we now have a name. It's not the Bay of Pigs 2.0. It's called Operation Gedeon. And I know a little Spanish, but I don't know exactly what the word means in this context. So we have some reporting here that comes from mainstream media, The Guardian once again. And by the way, The Guardian is, in my view, very much in favor of regime change in Venezuela. Nevertheless, it wrote, opposition leader Juan Guaido, who the U.S. has backed to be president of Venezuela, cast doubt on the government's version of Sunday's events, insisting Maduro is seeking to distract from other problems. But then he demanded fair treatment for the mercenaries who've been captured. And as always, we get better and more complete coverage from independent media. And again, I'm quoting from Alan McLeod, a very versatile reporter at Mint Press News. And he updated his story from yesterday. The government of Venezuela is celebrating after thwarting another foreign-backed coup attempt on Sunday, just 2 days after another self-declared coup attempt by interim president, that's in quotes, Juan Guaido, ended in total failure. A flotilla of small speedboats filled with up to 300 paramilitary units, and that's an increase. Yesterday I reported just about one boat that apparently had 10 armed men on it, and that 8 of the would-be invaders were killed. That number has been confirmed, the 8 number, but I was at that point not aware of the larger number of mercenaries. Not all Americans, but the Americans appear to be leading the effort. So they left a port in Colombia heading for Caracas, or at least a port about 20 miles away, where they aimed to kickstart an insurrection. They confidently predicted they would be in the presidential palace Miraflores within 96 hours. But the mission went spectacularly wrong almost immediately as they were intercepted by the Venezuelan Navy, who reportedly killed at least 8 in the fighting at sea. And in a separate report, we're told that one of their speedboats ran out of gas. You got to plan for these things if you're going to try to attempt a maritime invasion. And later in the article, McLeod writes, both Guaido and the U.S. State Department denied any involvement in this embarrassing affair. The Maduro regime has been consistent in its use of misinformation in order to shift focus from its mismanagement of Venezuela. Okay. And here's the guy, the American who's leading this effort. He owns a company based in South Florida. His name is Jordan Goudreau, an ex-Green Beret, owner of a large private mercenary organization. And he came forward to reveal that he organized this coup attempt, and he had the receipts to prove it. He produced a signed $212 million contract drawn up between him and Guaido. And, the U.S. has released money that was being held for the state of Venezuela directly to Guaido. So then we learn that Guaido has stiffed him. Didn't even make the $1.5 million down payment. So this, McLeod even has a copy of the agreement dated October 16th, 2019. So this is information that I didn't see in the Washington Post, and I know has not yet been reported in the New York Times. So this is quite a little scene as Americans are diverted, and we know that they claim that there's been drug running from Venezuela, and the DEA has been a part of setting up a naval blockade around Venezuela. But where were the U.S. gunboats when these speedboats were aiming for different shores of Venezuela over the past week or so? It is funny, but it shows that it's business as usual, or even things have been accelerated. And you got to say that it was the Democrat Rahm Emanuel, former White House chief of staff and strong-arm mayor of Chicago, who covered up the police scandals there, including the murder of Laquan McDonald. Anyway, he said, you never want to let a crisis go to waste. On to a heartfelt email that I received this morning from a woman named Najeen Mossad. And she is based in Berkeley, across the bay from me. She writes, I'm the owner of Berkeley Community Physical Therapy, a small business in the heart of downtown Berkeley. And she tells the story she used her life savings to buy the business after working there as a physical therapist for 9 years. She's a single mom, 2 teenage boys. She said that she was just breaking even when she had to shut down because of the shelter-in-place orders, despite the fact that she had a business considered essential. Because it is high touch, staff didn't want to work and patients, clients, were reluctant to attend physical therapy. So then she heard about the payroll protection plan in the CARES Act. She said, I got busy with my bookkeeper, prepared all the necessary paperwork. I went to the bank, but they weren't ready for my application. Weeks passed, and somehow I became the first to apply at my bank, and 2 weeks later I got a notice that I had received the money. Hallelujah, right? Well, now she's not so sure, because the time limits on using this money and having the loan forgiven are so unrealistic that so far she hasn't spent the money because she fears that she will have to give it back. She says, as I began to look deeper into the requirements of using PPP money, I came to realize that I won't be able to use this money for payroll in the time that the program allows, and its unrealistic requirement for rehiring my complete staff cannot be met. Meanwhile, my rent is $5,000 a month. My small savings for the business is beginning to dwindle. All the financial burdens and frustrations of the last few months, I believe this is too much for small businesses like mine to overcome. And she is raising this issue, hoping that leaders in Washington will rewrite the program. Now, I'm sure there's some Democrats like her Congresswoman, Barbara Lee, who'd be willing to do that in a minute. But the cumbersome process of getting that passed through the House and then through the Mitch McConnell Senate make it appear virtually impossible. So Najeen didn't ask for $100 from my community fund, but I'm going to send it to her today. It's just a way of showing some consideration to the plight that she faces. It's not going to solve her problems, but it might buy some groceries for her and her 2 teenage sons and signal that there are people who care. And I have a friend, he doesn't want to be named publicly right now, but his 30-year small business, based here in Marin County, is likely to go into bankruptcy because it is like physical therapy, a high-touch business, and he doesn't expect it to come back fast enough for him to continue to shell out the rent and other costs. And so he's seriously considering bankruptcy in the very near future. These are very hard times, and the economic impact is severe on small businesses and people who are the most vulnerable, who are hourly workers who got laid off, like the people who work at Amazon. And we've got to praise a vice president of engineering, also called he has a title of some kind of a special recognized engineer. His name is Tim Bray. And yesterday he announced that he is leaving the company, risking $1 million in salary and stock options because he internally sided with the workers who were demonized. These $15 an hour warehouse employees who protested the risk of exposure to the virus in their poor working conditions and the failure of the promises from Amazon for 2 weeks of sick pay if they contracted the virus. And Bray called the firings of organizers at the company chicken shit, said that the firings were designed to create a climate of fear. He had worked at Amazon for 6 years. And Kevin Gosztola at Shadowproof offers details of some of the whistleblowers at Amazon who have been terminated. These are some of the people who Tim Bray has named in his strong statement when he quit the company. And Gosztola reports that Bray went through the so-called proper channels, engaged in discussions with the appropriate people. But he said remaining an Amazon VP would have meant, in effect, signing off on actions that he despised. So let's just profile one of the people who he stood for, Gerald Bryson. The corporation informed Bryson, who was a warehouse employee on Staten Island, that he was fired for using vulgar language. But Bryson, who worked for Amazon for a year and a half, said it was just retribution for me organizing and protesting. I'm disgusted. I feel violated. And in a longer profile over at BuzzFeed, they take a look at one of the workers, Thomas Pausawan, a father of two who works at a warehouse of Amazon's outside Philadelphia. And he tested positive for the coronavirus and came down with the disease. And under Amazon policy, he was eligible for paid sick leave. But Amazon stopped paying him the day after he got home from urgent care with a fever of 104, labored breathing, and a diagnosis of a potentially fatal disease. It's the latest example of Amazon failing to promptly follow through on its promise to pay 2 weeks of wages to employees who are sick or quarantined. And so it tells his story how, finally, as Amazon became aware that BuzzFeed was about to publish this story yesterday, they deposited some back pay in this man's bank account. But for a month, while he was sick, and he made repeated calls to the right people at the company, he filled out all the forms, he got the note from his doctor that said he was sick with the coronavirus, and he got the shaft. They gave me my case manager's extension, but whenever I tried to call that extension, the only answer I got was, your case manager isn't available right now. How can someone be unavailable for a whole month? So that's how it is across America today. And I just want to reiterate, we do have funds in the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund. And if $100 would help you even get through a couple of days, if not, to next Monday, please get in touch. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. I'd love to help you out. In other news in Washington, one of the reasons McConnell insisted on the Senate being in session this week is not to simply confirm more young, white, conservative judges, but to try to roll through the confirmation of a Trump partisan, and a real outspoken one at that, Congressman John Ratcliffe, Republican of Texas, who has no qualifications to be the Director of National Intelligence, except that he did serve on the House Intelligence Committee for one term. But he's been a deep defender of Trump. The only thing we agree on is that Russiagate was mostly bullshit. But he's acting like Bill Barr, the angelic Bill Barr, who buffaloed Congress into his confirmation for a second time as the Attorney General, this time under Trump, and is now abusing his authority at the Justice Department in many ways. See if you believe this statement from Ratcliffe. You have my commitment to deliver timely, accurate, and objective intelligence and speak truth to power, be that with Congress or within the administration. Let me be very clear. Regardless of what anyone wants our intelligence to reflect, the intelligence I will provide, if confirmed, will not be impacted or altered as a result of outside influence. Yes, bullshit is the best way to describe that comment. Now to our daily COVID-19 update prepared by Linda Lewis. The worldwide death count attributed to the coronavirus is over 250,000, 255,000. In the United States, it's rolled past 70,000. Britain has now overtaken Italy by just a few hundred deaths. They're essentially tied for the number of dead people linked to the virus. And Linda reports that in April, scientists in China identified more than 30 genetic variations of the new coronavirus, a development which they warned could complicate the engineering of drugs and vaccines. In a separate report that I saw this morning at the LA Times, scientists at Los Alamos National Laboratory report a new strain of the coronavirus appeared in Europe in February, migrated to the east coast of the United States, and since March, it has become the dominant strain around the world. It spreads faster and may make people more vulnerable to a second infection with the disease. If the pandemic fails to wane seasonally as the weather warms, this study says, the virus could undergo further mutations even as research organizations prepare the first medical treatments and vaccines. So it is a shifting enemy. And potentially, people with immunity to earlier strains would not be immune to newer, mutated strains. And we've seen repeated warnings from Anthony Fauci that there is no guarantee at this point that having it and getting over it makes you immune to a future outbreak. Jeremy Kanindick, who, according to Vox, is an expert in disease outbreak preparedness, says that April was another lost month in the federal government's battle with the virus. After making gains in March, the U.S. failed to continue scaling up measures and get the virus under control. And we are certainly not doing enough testing. And to me, that is the biggest failing of the current efforts occurring in many states to lift the restrictions that have been in place. California Governor Newsom did modify some of the orders, taking effect over the next few days. Retail operations of just about every kind can do online ordering and pick up at the store. And the supply chains for those outlets are able to resume operations. There are a few others, like golf and elective surgery. So it is a modification of the restrictions here in California. Now, late last night, Trump was feverishly tweeting because apparently he saw this 1-minute TV ad coming from the Lincoln Project, and that's an anti-Trump group of Republicans led by Mr. Kellyanne Conway, or Moonface, as Trump has tagged him. I don't really care to repeat all of those nicknames, but that's a fact. His name's George Conway. He's a D.C. lawyer, and he is a frequent critic of Trump on Twitter and occasionally writes opinion pieces for the Washington Post. And riffing off Ronald Reagan's Morning in America, they have a TV ad called MOUR, Morning in America. And it's kind of dystopian in its visuals, accurately presenting the dark days of 2020 here in the United States. And Linda transcribed it. There's Morning in America. More than 60,000 Americans have died from a deadly virus Donald Trump ignored. With the economy in shambles, more than 26 million Americans are out of work. It's now over 30, and that's the official count. The worst economy in decades. Trump bailed out Wall Street, but not Main Street. This afternoon, millions of Americans will apply for unemployment, and with their savings run out, many are giving up hope. Millions are concerned that their loved ones won't survive COVID-19. There's Morning in America, and under the leadership of Donald Trump, our country weaker, sicker, poorer. Now Americans are asking, if we have another 4 years of this, will there even be an America? And just a flavor of Trump's tweets, he's lashing out at all kinds of Republicans who haven't supported him, and he basically calls them losers because they were unable to defeat him, and they didn't get Mitt Romney elected, and they didn't get John McCain elected. So he says, They don't know how to win. Their so-called Lincoln Project is a disgrace to Honest Abe. I don't know what Kellyanne did to her deranged loser of a husband, Moonface, but it must have been really bad. And this is just childish. It is such, bully on the playground behavior. And we're stuck with it for now. So it's interesting because this morning as I drove to the secret studio, I punched up Rush Limbaugh, and he's been absent quite a bit from his radio show recently. He's getting treatment for stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. And I personally don't wish him ill, but his commentary is just so disgusting. So one of the things that he said that has been repeated by Trump, so it is an official Republican talking point, is that the states that are slow to so-called reopen are all run by Democrats. And then Rush advanced the talking point to say that Democrats want economic ruin in order to bring down Trump and to promote socialism. And I wish Democrats really wanted to promote some socialistic programs or ideas, like Medicare for all and giving people relief from student loan debt. But the idea that the elected leaders of the Democratic Party want the economy to fail, want to keep hurting those who are most vulnerable, I think, and I'm a sharp critic of much that the corporate Democrats advocate these days. But that is a really cruel lie. And I'm sure that his listeners just lap it up. So here's the quote from Trump. Arizona, watch out. He's on his way there today. He said the Democrats want the government's response to coronavirus to fail. They frankly want our situation to be unsuccessful, which means death. And that he won't let Dr. Fauci and others testify before Democratic-controlled House committees because it's a setup. Now, the White House says they're just too busy fighting the pandemic. And we'll get to that comment in a couple of minutes. So, in contrast to what I brought you a little bit earlier from the anonymous researchers, University of Cambridge researchers investigating the origin of the virus found that it may have begun in September and possibly farther south in China than Wuhan. Researcher Peter Forster said the virus may have stayed inside a bat or other animal or even a human for several months without infecting other individuals. Then it started infecting and spreading among humans between September 13th and December 7th. And previously, the Cambridge team published a paper that found that most strains sampled in the United States and Australia were genetically closer to a bat virus than those found in patients from across East Asia. And Fauci has dismissed the Wuhan lab as a source of the coronavirus. And Linda's final item here in her report today, a Republican lawsuit may force Wisconsin to reopen and disable the state's public health agency. That's Republican values at work. And you've probably heard the projections, some of which came in a leak from the White House, others independent from the University of Washington. But they are projecting that the daily death toll during the month of May will double to about 3,000 per day. Well, 70% increase. It's currently averaging about 1,750. And they argue that their models are moving upward because reopening the economy will make matters worse. They also say that the total death count today at about 68,000 will double by the beginning of August. I mentioned the White House ban on task force members appearing before Congress, even friendly committees controlled by Republican senators. And this comes as I sat down to record today. The headline at the Washington Post is the White House has announced that it's winding down the task force. Yeah, Trump has declared blue skies for all. It's over. You got nothing to worry about. Well, they weren't doing much anyway. Then there was the Crown Prince Jared Kushner's separate, parallel effort, which was populated by 24 employees from the Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, and other firms. Some volunteered their time and got paid by their companies. Others just volunteered. But a whistleblower has described their efforts as inept, unfocused, and that these people were so inexperienced in the field that they were trying to operate in, getting medical supplies, for example, that it has been largely ineffective. The whistleblower report alleges that the team responsible for PPE had little success in helping the government secure equipment, in part because none of them had significant experience in healthcare, procurement, or supply chain operations. And we know that at many points their efforts either delayed or obstructed the efforts by mainline government employees. So the idea that the death toll will climb because of the reopening, which is being authorized primarily at the state level, gets additional validation in a leaked phone call, a conference call led by Texas Governor Greg Abbott on the very day that he was reopening Texas. That's Friday, May 1st. And he's quoted in this recording, "How do we know reopening businesses won't result in faster spread of more cases of COVID-19? Listen, the fact of the matter is pretty much every scientific and medical report shows that whenever you have a reopening, whether you want to call it a reopening of business or just a reopening of society, in the aftermath of something like this, it actually will lead to an increase in spread. It's almost ipso facto." Later on the call, he said, "The more that you have people out there, the greater the possibility is for transmission." And yet, he went ahead, inviting people to movie theaters. They have to, they can't put a full crowd in a movie theater, but still. I've seen pictures of Texans lining up at the theaters, no masks, and apparently no concern. So let's contrast that with the projection of compassion, at least by New York Governor Cuomo. At his daily press conference, he asked, "How much is a human life worth? The faster we reopen, the lower the economic costs, but the higher the human costs because of the more lives lost. That, my friends, is the decision we are really making. To me, a human life is priceless. Our reopening plan doesn't have a trade-off." And he said he would have a circuit breaker to reimpose restrictions if the virus begins to rapidly spread and send people into hospitals. The debate now is, Cuomo continued, blue states have the coronavirus. The Republicans are saying we don't want to give money to the blue states. And he said it doesn't kill Democrats or Republicans, it kills Americans. And contrast that, if you will, with an op-ed in today's Guardian under the byline of Francine Prose. And let me give you the gist of what she said, and then I have something else to add. She basically comments that the reporters who have sifted through Donald Trump's press briefings, hour after hour of bombast, self-promotion, vitriol, lies, and recklessly unscientific speculation for any evidence of sympathy for those who are in pain or who have lost loved ones, well, the elapsed total time is less than 5 minutes of any kind of remotely compassionate expression by this man. She writes, Trump's enraged, self-infatuated maunderings are the opposite of Roosevelt's calm resolve, yet ultimately our president's failure of empathy is less disturbing than the ways in which it appears to resonate with his supporters. So, another quote from my 15-minute listening session on Rush Limbaugh's show this morning. He responded, he actually cited this article, and he read the very paragraph that I quoted to you. But then he said, what Trump would say doesn't matter, but his relentless optimism is what drives him to ignore the pleasantries of feeling sorry for people and expressing his sympathy, and that it's his drive to win that is the true expression of his compassion for his fellow Americans. Right. And then, because he was away last week, presumably getting some health care that he can easily afford, he wanted to comment on Trump's ridiculous commentary at one of the last briefings, where he speculated about using disinfectant and injecting it into people. And while Limbaugh allowed us how Trump was thinking out loud, and he probably shouldn't do that on national TV, and that Trump was not using sarcasm, as he later tried to explain it away, that it was all okay, because it's just Donald being Donald, and he wants to drive people to, get past their own limitations and make new discoveries, like injecting disinfectant. There are two reports today in alternative media that simply ridicule the ideas being promoted by Apple and Google that they can create contact tracing programs using just the Bluetooth in your smartphone, not the geolocation, which brings up all kinds of privacy issues. And to his credit, Sam Biddle at The Intercept actually tracked down the inventors of Bluetooth. They're two Scandinavians. What country are they from? Denmark. Harold Bluetooth Gormson and his partner, whose name is Martinson. I don't have the first name here. Anyway, they derided Bluetooth as the humble wireless technology included in some form in nearly every portable device for the last 10 years and beyond. And they also, I'll just tell you a quick story. My son gave us a really nice Bluetooth boombox, and it's got flashing lights and great sound. It's stereo in one unit, but it was clearly made in South Korea. And when you turn it on, it says in this thickly accented female voice, and I'm going to mimic it, but I'm not trying to be disrespectful to anyone who doesn't speak perfect English, but she says, "The Bluetooth is ready to pair." And then when you actually connect it to an iPhone or other device, she then says, "The Bluetooth is connected." And we crack up every time we enable that Bluetooth device. Here it is, Sven Mattisson, Mattisson. He is the co-inventor of Bluetooth. And they say, look, Bluetooth is not accurate when you try to figure out the location. It could be accurate to 2 meters or accurate to 20 meters in identifying the Bluetooth of another person who's in the room or in the location where someone who becomes infected is. So you want to trace that back, and you look at the Bluetooth data that's collected in these apps that are in development. Only Bluetooth is so subject to interference from walls, from windows, that the inventors themselves say that it's not a reliable way to track people. And they also note separately that unless large groups of people engage in this contact tracing and risk their privacy, that it's never going to work anyway. And then over at BuzzFeed, who's writing this? Caroline Haskins. She says that Apple and Google have said that they're only going to provide essentially the blueprints, the technical foundations, so that public health officials can use that to create their own apps. And if that's where the state of the art is today, then these will not be in place anytime soon. And it appears that the whole thing is a dead end, a cul-de-sac. I was amused by a report today in the Washington Post under the byline of Paul Farhi. He is a media commentator at the Post. And he unpacked the fake news that was recently infecting American media that Kim Jong-un of North Korea was either brain dead or had died. And I have put up a link to this article right next to the one that I shared with you yesterday by Ben Norton at the Gray Zone Project. And Norton discloses so much more than Mr. Farhi does at the Washington Post. For example, in Farhi's unpacking of what led to these fake news reports in the United States, he does properly blame NK News. But he doesn't mention their funding into the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year by the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, a front for the for the CIA. He simply says that Daily NK monitors news, gossip, and rumors from North America. He doesn't make the connection to the Unification Church, the Moonies, who own the Washington Times, which is the competitor, to some extent. I don't know if they view it that way at the Washington Post, but they do operate in the same market and compete for readers. And so I invite you to look at these two because it shows you the intentional limits, the gatekeeping of the corporate media in this country. And it also shows you the courageous work of operations like Mint Press News, like the Gray Zone Project, and to some extent The Intercept. And what is the Post's new democracy dies in darkness? Well, they keep the lights really dim just to keep a pulse going. And this article slams TMZ. CNN didn't report the death. They said that intelligence sources were raising questions about Kim's health and whether he was still alive. And they didn't bother to ding the New York Post at all, which appears to be the first U.S. outlet that published the information from the Daily NK. And then we get a little sermon at the end of this article. There's a bullet and it says, "Don't trust, verify." While it's hard to know even in the best of times what's going on inside North Korea, the rumors about Kim emerged in an even more challenging environment when the country was even more tightly sealed off than usual because of the coronavirus. That should have put the press on even higher guard for misinformation. Well, this is unfortunately disinformation because either Paul Farhi didn't bother to look up what's going on at the Gray Zone or even Google NK or Daily NK. And if he discovered the funding to Daily NK from the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, did his editors tap him on the shoulder and say, no, don't go there? So we live in a time where you cannot trust the media. And this is another example that feeds Trump's claims of fake news. And I don't go so far as to say the Washington Post is the enemy of the people. But you have to ask, why don't they report the full story? It's right out there on the internets. Some uneven commentary today is the only new piece that I found about Tara Reade and her accusations against Joe Biden. It's by Michelle Goldberg at the New York Times. And curiously, she says, the one thing in common between Tara Reade and Christine Blasey Ford is that Ryan Grimm at The Intercept was pivotal in surfacing their stories. And then she says that, and I didn't know this and I can't verify it, but I tend to believe her, that Tara Reade tweeted Ryan Grimm 2 weeks before he actually published her story. And it's quoted here as, "Yup, period, timing, ... Wait for it, ... tick-tock." So it appears that Grimm and Reade talked about when the story should surface. And that Reade tweeted that back at Grimm after he said that Biden would fare poorly in the two-person race against Bernie Sanders. And according to Goldberg, a few weeks later, a political bomb went off. So I can't confirm that, but let's say it's true. That's an effort to make Reed look bad. Then she counters it with, to be clear, the fact that Reed timed her charges for maximum political impact doesn't mean they're not true. If Biden assaulted her, it's understandable she'd want to destroy him politically. Her story about that assault has changed, but as my colleague Elizabeth Bruning, I quoted her yesterday, she is saying that Biden should be sidelined and the Democrats should replace him as the nominee. So then she tweaks Reed for inconsistencies about whether she actually filed a claim against Joe Biden and called it sexual harassment. Then she puts the brakes on. Again, none of this means an assault didn't happen. Reed's former neighbor, Linda Lacoste, says she recently remembered that Reed told her the story in 1995 or 96. But then Goldberg says it's hard to compare Blasey Ford's case with Reed's. Blasey had 4 sworn affidavits from people whom she told that she'd been assaulted, as well as therapist notes, and the result from a polygraph. Well, I can't speak for Tara Reid, but if she'd take a polygraph, I'm not sure it would mean much. We have a listener named George Maschke, who is based in Den Haag, The Hague in the Netherlands, who is a longtime critic of the polygraph, and he has swayed me that, it is not as determinative as many people want to believe. Anyway, at the end of the piece, Goldberg writes, I suspect that whatever happens in the campaign, the credibility of the Me Too movement will suffer. The original stories were carefully and meticulously documented. I don't agree with that. I simply don't. Anyway, she believes the movement will suffer as a result, and that's pretty obvious, I think. I want to note that my friend Norman Solomon, together with other progressive leaders who backed Bernie Sanders, are forming a political action committee. And this isn't the one that Jeff Weaver and the other Sanders professionals are forming to raise money to support Joe Biden, which I deplore. This is Nina Turner. It is, who else is involved here? I mentioned Norman Solomon. Alan Minsky, Executive Director of PDA, Progressive Democrats of America. And their effort is to raise money to campaign and run ads, advocate to keep the progressive policies of Medicare for All and other centerpieces of the Bernie Sanders campaign alive and viable. And these are people who I respect, even though I'm not a Democrat and I don't think much of the Democratic Party, and I don't particularly believe that, getting a platform that supports Medicare for All will mean anything to Joe Biden. But I applaud their effort. And I like these people, the ones I know, individually. Now, this needs a little explaining. I have cited recently items from David Sirota's new newsletter called TMI. Sirota was part of the Sanders campaign, a speechwriter and media advisor, and he's based in Colorado. His wife, Emily, is a member of the lower house of the state legislature. And so Sirota didn't write this piece that appears at his Substack site. He has a colleague, Andrew Perez, who has joined his team. So Perez brings us this story that as of January of this year, Colorado Democrats were promoting what they called a public health insurance option. It's not quite Medicare for all, but it's also not just pure Aetna or, whatever Blue Cross Blue Shield, the totally for-profit health insurance companies. So there was a ballot measure. It was supported by Jared Polis, the governor, and now it is on life support. After heavy lobbying, and this newsletter exposes the anti-Medicare for All effort run by a guy named Chip Kahn, president of the Federation of American Hospitals, and marshaled by a lobbyist named Forbes Tate. They got a hold of Mr. Tate's his invoice. to whoever pays him. I don't quite see that here. But it shows that he spent $2.7 million on broadcast cable digital advertising paid directly by the client to a vendor. So that was the amount of money spent on that one effort. And it appears that they have created wobbly knees of the other Democrats in the legislature, and it's unlikely to pass. And finally, today, I want to recommend to you a piece by Joshua Cho, published on April 24th. I've been waiting to find room for this, but it's at FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Headline, Corporate Media Deny Their Own Existence Despite Driving Biden's Primary Victory. And it parallels some of what I discussed with Norman Solomon in our recent interview, how the media acted as gatekeepers, and after Bernie finally pulled out, following, of course, the ambush by Anderson Cooper. Congrats on your new baby, Anderson. But Anderson Cooper led to the takedown of Bernie Sanders, who was surging in the early primaries, especially looked good in California. And after the Nevada caucus, leading up to South Carolina, we saw the ambush where Sanders took the bait, defended Castro's Cuba. That then dominated the next debate. And Biden then surged through forces that are still not visible to me. At any rate, it is a good recap of many of the articles that were published, many of the patterns of television reporting and non-reporting on Bernie Sanders that led to the dismal outcome that we face today. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. And you'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.